What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the channel. Today's video, we dive into some rotation-proof decks. Yes, these decks are a little early. We do still have two more sets of Magic to come out before rotation actually hits standard, but some people are asking if, I can make some decks. These are a little bit early in that sense, but I went ahead and I kind of crafted some decks, put them together, kind of thinking about some ideas that could possibly be viable come rotation. There are a couple of ideas I'm still kind of working on and tweaking, and I'm kind of waiting to see the new summer set come out for D&D to kind of see how a couple of those ideas will work out, one of them being the party mechanic. But with that being said, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. If you do both, it puts a +1/+1 counter on the channel, which is definitely good for the YouTube algorithm. With that being said, let's just dive in the video and let's just talk about it. So first and foremost, before we dive into the first deck, I just kind of wanted to give you guys an idea of how I kind of went about making these decks with the cards I chose for the decks. And essentially what I did is I kind of go into the filters here in our the advanced filter area, and all I did was I selected Zendikar Horizon, Call Time, and Strixhaven. And what that's just going to do is these are the sets that are going to be lasting post September, so I only use cards that were from these sets to craft these decks. So like I said, if I am missing cards that would exist in other sets that you may have actually included in maybe a current version of a list that's somewhat similar to these decks, that is the reason why it's not in there, because it's not going to be in rotation after September. But with that being said, let's dive in the first deck and let's kind of talk about what's happening here. So the first deck is Izzet Giants, and I do think this is kind of one of those decks that's kind of it popped up I think when Call Time first released, but I do kind of find it interesting with kind of like what we're left over with, kind of come that post rotation kind of thing. The reason why I think it's kind of an interesting deck is because I do think there's some good cards that got introduced with Strixhaven that kind of help out this kind of like mid-rangey kind of control-y style deck. And the one thing I will say that is a little bit tough, you may see some footage pop up of me playing this deck, is to kind of really test the deck out in full, just because I'm playing against other people who are playing the whole standard library currently. So it is kind of hard to say how this matches up against cards that also will be in rotation. The one thing I will say as well before I kind of dive into each card, I know, I'm sorry, I'm going on a lot about other things, but there is going to probably more than likely, because they did it last year, there's probably going to be an event that's going to pop up, come out in August or late July after the D&D set comes out, and it'll be like a kind of like pre-rotation kind of like event kind of style gameplay where you can kind of play decks that are going to be with only cards that are going to be come from September and going forward. So it'd be kind of an interesting thing to kind of try these decks out when that time comes. But with that being said, the first deck is Izzet Giants. And like I said, this is a deck that I think popped up when Call Time first released. It is a snow deck, so we are playing snow lands. One thing I will say, I may kind of want to adjust some of the lands because we are playing the Pathway, which kind of, hinders our snow ability. But I do think it's kind of a good land to have if you're playing a little bit of an aggressive deck. You don't want to take a turn off to play something like a Wild Tile forward, just to kind of get your red-blue fix. And the other thing, too, is we don't know what lands are going to come in the D&D set, and like the dual lands or what kind of style lands, if we're going to get any. So this may change in that sense as well. But the idea here overall is we're playing snow, because I just think it fits like the style of, when you think Giants, these are kind of the things you think of. And so we are playing Frostbite as being one of our spot removals, being a 1-mana shock. Shock is not in, I think, current Magic come rotation, so this is a good replacement. With the snow, it can be a 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, which is definitely very good at instant speed. We have Glimpse of the Cosmos, which is a very strong card for Giants. Allows you to essentially look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. And then as long as we control a Giant, we can redo it and do it again, which is definitely very good. And then if you would cast it a second time, we'd essentially exile it. So getting 2 effects of this sorcery speed is definitely very strong, and especially for the second time paying only 1 mana is definitely very good. We also add in Jawari Disruption, because I do kind of feel like this deck, to kind of last and to get to that mid-range, we need some sort of early game disruption besides removal. And I do think having a counter that can be a spot removal, a spot counter for 2 mana is definitely very good. If we draw in the late game and we feel like our opponent can tap, cover that 1 mana cost that they would have to pay in order to not have it countered, we can always play it as a blue land and tapped, which is definitely also a very good second option. Then we got Expressive Iteration, which is definitely a fun card, I think, from Strixhaven that is definitely very good for these kind of style of decks that you want to draw a lot, have a lot of tempo kind of going on. And I do think this is a tempo style deck because we want to last until that mid-range. And Expressive Iteration is another very good card, I think, overall. You look at the top 3 cards of your library, you put one of them into your hand, the rest on the bottom of your library and then one into exile that you can play this turn, which is definitely very good. So it's like a draw. It's like a draw 2 in a way. I would say if you play it on turn 2, whatever you play in your exile is not going to be able to be played. So you kind of want to use it when you have open mana so that you can actually play the spell that you're going to put in your exile. Or even if it's a land, you want to put a land, make sure you can play the land that you put in your exile. But overall, very strong card that can dig a little bit deeper if we're looking for some sort of answer. Then we have Saw coming to kind of go along with that kind of early game disruption. It's a very good solid spell just to have. Foretell is a very good ability, so we can always pay the Foretell cost early, and then in the later game we can always pay the 2 mana to then cast it to counter target spell. Just kind of feels good to fit in the style of deck if we're gonna go for that little bit of mid-rangey combo kind of thing. So definitely very good there. Then we got Aggro, the Freezing Flame. It's a 3-mana 3/3. Whenever a creature, planeswalker, and opponent controls is dealt excess damage. If a giant, wizard, or a spell you control dealt this damage to this turn, we get to draw a card. So essentially, if anything, we swing in with any of our creatures or deal any damage with any of our things, and maybe we pinged like a 1/1 or a 2/2 or something, we're going to draw a card off of it, which is definitely very good. I do think having that tempo and keeping our hand pretty full of having things that we can react with and kind of continue to draw the things we're looking for is definitely very good overall. Then we got the Calamity Bearer. It's another interesting card here because, when rotation happens, a lot of the Thornel Veil Drain cards leave. So I do think Calamity Bearer is going to be one of those cards that's going to make red do a little bit excess damage, especially for giants, because it is if a giant sorcerer we control deal damage to a permanent or a player, it deals double that damage to that permanent or player instead. So it's a 3/4 and essentially makes everything hit for double, which is definitely very good. It definitely finishes games as we're trying to grind into that mid-range game. And when our creatures come out of the battlefield, even being a 3-power creature, hitting for 6 is definitely going to, ping our opponent's life total very, very quickly. So definitely a very strong card in that sense. Then to kind of continue the snow theme, just kind of dig a little bit deeper, just because I do think, I don't know, I kind of built this with the idea that we want to keep our hand full, find the answers we needed. I decided to put in some Graven Lures to draw, 5 mana, draw X, or scry X, where X is the amount of snow we paid, and then draw 3 cards is definitely very good. It helps us look for that answer, or look for the card to finish off the game in total. But it's a very solid card just overall. 5 mana instant speed, scry a lot, and and based on how many snow, because we are playing snow, definitely a pretty solid card just to kind of help us refill our hand back up in the later game. Then we got Squash here. It's an interesting spell. It's an instant 5-mana spell that deals 6 damage to target creature or planeswalker. Yet again, it's another creature removal. I don't really know how aggressive the format will be come post-rotation, but I do think having a decent amount of creature removal in the early game, especially in best of 1, is definitely very good, because a lot of aggro decks will pop up when rotation happens, just because aggro decks tend to have higher win rates early on. But having a 6 damage to any creature or planeswalker is very solid, and the spell costs 3 less to cast if we control a giant, which our deck has a fair share amount of, so it definitely can be on the cheaper side. 6 damage, definitely very good at instant speed for possibly only 2 mana, is definitely going to be pretty awesome. Then we have Quakebringer in the deck. It's a 5/4. Your opponents can't gain life, which is definitely very good. I don't know how strong life gain is going to be come rotation, but at the beginning of our upkeep, Quakebringer deals 2 damage to each opponent. This ability triggers only if Quakebringer is on the battlefield, or if Quakebringer is in our graveyard and you control a giant. So essentially, we ping our opponent every turn, as long as either there's one or the other is happening, and then we can foretell them in the early game and set them up for a turn 4 place as a 5/4, which is definitely pretty strong as well. And I do think the ability to make our opponent not gain life is always very good, because lifelink is a thing, and who knows what they're going to introduce with the D&D set, and also the Innistrad set coming in September. With what lifelink we're going to get with that. Then we got the Battle of the Frost and Fire, which is an interesting spell here. It's kind of like one of our really only board wipe outside of our spot removal. It deals 4 damage to each non-giant creature on Chapter 1. We can scry 3 on Chapter 2, and then on Chapter 3, whenever we cast a spell with mana value of 5 or greater, this turn draw 2 cards and then discard a card. So it's another card that gives us tempo, just a way to dig a little bit deeper into the deck overall. I don't know. Maybe I'm way too heavy on the tempo. I mean, you guys are always free to give me some feedback based on this. Like I said, I've only minorly play tested it, but it's very hard to kind of really see how much certain things work just based on how the meta is currently. But it's an interesting card to help us dig a little bit deeper. But I do think the board wipe, for that essentially 4 mana damage across the board is definitely very good. It helps with the aggro matchups where they play a lot of small things, so definitely very good in that sense. Then we got Practical Research. It's another interesting card here. I don't really know. Maybe you play one or the other when it comes to Graven Lore or Practical Research. That's why there's only 2 and 2. It's because I'm kind of like doing that split. But essentially, it's a 5-mana draw 4 cards, then discard 2 cards unless you discard an instant or sorcery card. Which we do play a fair share of instants and sorceries, so we can always get rid of Jashwari Disruption that's not doing anything, or Glimpse of the Cosmos. But digging for 4 cards is definitely very good. And even if we have to discard 2 cards, you know, drawing 4 cards in the process is definitely a pretty strong play at instant speed. So it's definitely one of those things that you can always play this, or you can play the Graven Lord depending on how, certain wild cards you do have. Then in like the top end of our deck, it's kind of like interesting here, just because this is yet one of those things. We do lose Bone Crusher, which I didn't mention earlier on in the deck, which is kind of one of those like big losses because it is very good spot removal in the early game and then can be a decent sized body on turn 3. But we add in Cyclo Summoner, which is another interesting card. It's a giant wizard. I really don't know how good he's going to be either. But if we cast it from our hand, return all permanents to their owner's hands except for giants, wizards, and lands. So essentially, it's like our one thing to kind of like just completely make our opponent return pretty much everything they own on their side of the board back into their hand, which is definitely very good. It's only a one-of in the deck because I don't think you're going to really be casting him all the time, but it's definitely one of those things when you do draw it, especially in those aggressive matchups. Maybe your opponent plays a lot of tokens. Bouncing a lot of things back to their hand is definitely going to be very good overall, and you know, it's a 7/7 for 7, which is not bad in that matter either. Now, the last card I have 2 copies of in the deck is Magma Opus. It's an interesting card. It's a decent spot removal, I do think, because it's deal 4 damage to divide as we choose among any number of targets. So we can do some damage to our opponent's face. We do some damage to some of their creatures. And we tap two of their permanents, which if they maybe we can do it on their turn during their combat step. Tap down 2 of their lands that they may be doing a post-combat kind of play. We tap them down. And then we also create a 4/4 blue-red elemental creature token, and we also draw 2 cards. The spell is very good. It's very strong, very powerful. And at the worst case scenario, if we really want to ramp up a little bit, we can always discard it for 2 mana, a red and a blue, or for either or. We discard it and we create a treasure token, which is also very good to help us ramp up. So overall, I mean, the deck is pretty decent, I would say. And the one cool thing in the mana base, besides playing snow mana, we got 8 and 8. Just kind of, I think it's a pretty even balance of blue and red. We have the 4 of the pathways. We have 3 of the fords. We also have the Faceless Haven, which the one interesting thing that I do think that it's interesting in the sense that it helps with our Calamity Bearer, because we can also make Faceless Haven a creature with Vigilance, and actually it's all creature type, so it counts as a giant. So when we do swing in with the Faceless Haven, if we have a Calamity Bearer out on the battlefield, we can actually hit our opponent in the face for double the damage. So we can actually swing for 8 with a Faceless Haven, which is definitely very strong. And it's one of those things I do think that people forget, that it is technically a changeling land, so it is definitely an interesting land, and the fact that it kind of helps our tribal style deck that we are playing here. But like I said, let me know in the comments below what you think, what cards you may want to add into some sort of Izzet Giant style deck. I'm always open for feedback. It is still very early, so it's one of those things that we'll kind of see how things develop as we get closer and closer to September. So this next deck up on the list is kind of another deck I kind of made already a budget version of for current standard, but this is kind of like a post-rotation version of this Azorius Aggro style deck. It's yet again one of those things I'm kind of tweaking and kind of figuring out what kind of works, what kind of doesn't. Figuring out, what bounce spells, what removal we want to have. I mean, really don't have a lot of removal in blue and or white unless we do board wipes for the most part. But, we're trying to be aggressive. We're trying to, focus into the Magecraft ability. We're also, we're playing a little bit of Learn. We're playing a little bit of maybe if we get to the later game, we can always take some extra turns. As you kind of see, the deck is pretty straightforward. It plays a lot of cards you may have seen in that Azorius Aggro deck I already did once. So we got the Clever Lumimancer for the 1 mana 0/1 with Magecraft, and whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Guide and Voice would put a +1/+1 counter target creature. Learn. Stonebinder's Familiar, I think, is a card that a lot of people underestimated because they didn't really understand on how good the ability really is. But I do actually think Stonebinder's Familiar is actually very strong. It's a 1 mana 1/1, but whenever we exile one or more cards are put into our exile during our turn, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. And this ability only triggers once each turn. So the one thing why I do think this is pretty interesting is in 2 parts. Is one, every time we foretell a card, it's going to pump up our Stonebinder's Familiar. So if we're going to set up on maybe on turn 1 we play Stonebinders, turn 2 we foretell a drop the realm. It's going to pump up our Stonebinders, so it's a 2/2 on turn 2, which is definitely very good. And I do think that's why I actually that's one interaction there. Another interaction that's actually another thing that can also that's actually very interesting. I 100% haven't really fully tested it, but sorry, I had like a quick blink out. But so essentially another ability is with Mavinda here. Mavinda is actually very good as well. It's a bird advisor, student's advocate, yada yada yada, and it has the 0 ability, which is definitely very interesting that they gave it like a 0 cost ability. I guess they just wanted to have some sort of trigger ability. But essentially, we get to exile target instant or sorcery card from our graveyard this turn if that spell If that spell doesn't target a creature we control, it costs 8 or more, yada, yada, yada. But the whole goal here is we're trying to use it so we can repump our creatures. So if the spell would be put into the graveyard, exile instead, activate this ability only once each turn. So yet again, it's another ability that helps us with our Stonebinder's Familiar, because once we cast that spell, it's also another spell that can pump up Stonebinder. So if we cast any of our pump spells that are in the deck from Avinda's ability, it's also going to get pumped up that way. So it's one of those things that I do think that Spirit Dog is going to be one of those things you're going to see in these more aggressive style decks. Not really sure if this Azorius style deck will be a thing, but it is cool, kind of a cool idea to kind of combine it with some Foretell and kind of go with a little bit of that Magecraft kind of ability and seeing how large it can get. Now after that, we got the Cemetery Sage, which is a 1-mana 0/2 with flying, and it has the Magecraft ability when we cast a copy of spell, instant or sorcery. I mean, creatures you control has a base power of 2 until end of turn, so we can give itself 2 power. You can give a creature that has 0 power 2. We can give our Stonebinders, base power 2 plus the +1/+1 counter, so then it gets even larger, which is definitely very good there. So overall, pretty solid card, definitely for that early aggressive kind of play. And I did actually playtest this one, and this deck actually performed fairly okay. There's some times where, you kind of just get that nut hand, and you kind of just go off, and you do a lot of damage before your opponent can really react. But overall, this, it has a pretty solid early game, solid, turns 1, 2, and 3, and then we hopefully kind of finish our opponent by the time we get to like that mid-range game, just based on all the power we have in the early game. So we got Leonin Lightscribe as a 2-mana 2/2 with Magecraft. When we cast our copy and instant or sorcery spell, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Yet again, another very good thing. It helps us benefit with all the creatures we're going to be pumping out into the battlefield. Just overall, so definitely one of those things that's just going to help our overall team just become that much larger, become more threatening every time we play a spell. So overall, just kind of setting up for a very big swing in all. Then we got 2 Show of Confidence. This is one of those things I only have 2 of in the deck, because drawing this and being only able to play this is kind of very clunky. But, in the later game, if we do draw this, it's kind of one of those spells that benefits us because of copies, and it helps us trigger more Magecraft abilities. So essentially, whenever we cast a spell copy for each other instant or sorcery spell we've cast this turn, and then we choose new targets for the copy, and it puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature, it gains Vigilance. So it's one of those things that it benefits us the more spells that we've casted in our turn that instant or sorcery. So overall, very strong card. Combine that with some of our Foretell stuff, that becomes cheaper when we cast it. So just a decent card that can help pump up our board earlier in the game and become like very devastating when it comes to swinging. So I do have Depart the Realm in the deck, and I do think this is one of those spells that may pop up because we're losing some cards that come in that are in blue. It's kind of interesting because we can foretell it and it becomes cheaper. So in the early game, we can always foretell it, and then later game, when there's something bigger in our way, we can always bounce it back to their hand for the 1 blue mana, which I do think is actually pretty good. Kind of sets up, our spells for the later game. So when we go in our more aggressive swings, we do have things to kind of help us get through for that damage. So just a decent card, overall, kind of one of those things I kind of want to wait and see how it plays out based on how things kind of shift with the meta as a whole. Then we got Kaya's Onslaught. Yet again, another spell I do think kind of got lost in the mix. And I do think it becomes a little bit better when it comes to post rotation. Just the idea, it gives target creature +1/+1, and it gains double strike until end of turn, which I think in its own right, because we lose a lot of things that will help give double strike. Besides, I think Blade Master, I guess, is the only thing. Like mono red loses like Embercleave. So I do think this giving mono white double strike overall, and it combined with like Magecraft, is definitely very good. So whatever our opponents don't block, or maybe if they don't have any blocks, we can get in through a lot of damage. Maybe like very large Lumancer, very big Stonebinders, Symmetry Sage, Leonine Lightscribe, the various creatures we do have, getting in for that extra damage and double strike is definitely very good, and it's instant speed, so we can do it after our opponents decided they're blockers. So just overall, very, very good. I kind of already went over Mavinda. It's just kind of one of our things to help us reoccur our spells from our graveyard, allowing us to kind of keep on doing our Magecraft things in the later game. Combines very well with some of our exile, Stonebinder's Familiar, like I said before. And it's a 2/3 flyer, so overall pretty decent card because that's flying, so it can maybe fly over at the ground games. It's a little bit gummed up, so definitely very good there. Then we have the Divide by 0, because we're not playing any counters. We're playing like bounce spells in our way to kind of prevent things from sticking on the board. We can return target spell or permanent with a venom value of 1 or greater to its owner's hand, and then we also learn. We do have a learn board, which I'll get into after we kind of go through the rest of the deck. But overall, very good spell here. If our opponent tries to do some sort of board wipe, we can bounce it to their hand. They're tapped out now. They can't do anything about it. Then we learn to kind of replace the spell in our hand, so kind of like a 2-for-1 in a sense. We can also bounce a very large creature back to their hand. Or a permanent if there's something on the battlefield that's somehow preventing us from doing a lot of things. Definitely, has a couple decent abilities to it. Definitely very good overall. Then we got Mentor's Guidance, yet again another spell that I do think is okay, just because yet again it copies based on if we have a Planeswalker, Cleric, Druid, Shaman, Warlock, or Wizard. Our deck has Wizards, and I think it has Cleric, so we can actually copy it, twice, so we can get 3 copies, and it helps us just dig a little bit deeper because we do lose the Throne of Eldraine cards. I think what is it, a Body and Mind, or no, a Body and Mind is from Ikoria, so we lose that one. I think this is a decent replacement. It doesn't get any cheaper, which is a downfall, but I do think it's an overall decent card. It helps us scry one and then draw a card. It helps us fill our hand back up. Just helps us get a little bit more aggressive if we are able to, have it go off multiple times. And it's a 2-of in the deck just because I do think, you don't want to draw and have too many of these in our hand. But I do think it's one of those things when we do draw it in the later game, hopefully we can fill our hand back up pretty decently. And then in the late game, we kind of have 2 different spells here. We have Behold the Multiverse, yet again, scry 2, draw 2 cards, we can foretell it, so it's cheaper. I do think just keeping our hand full of possible spells is always very good, so it helps us kind of fill our hand back up. Worst case scenario, we played for the 4 mana. Best case scenario, we foretell it and we set up for a later turn when we feel like we're getting a little bit light and we need some more cards. And then the last card, of course, I think is Alrund's Epiphany. It kind of just sets it up if we kind of get flooded and we may have this out and it's foretold. We can set up possibly taking an extra turn, which essentially may be what we need to kind of just finish off our opponent if we get into that later game. But overall, very solid card. It's, taking extra turns in any deck is definitely very powerful. Your opponent takes off a turn, and they have to either decide if they're going to do a lot of their stuff on the current turn or wait until the following next turn and kind of see where things go. This helps us make our board more aggressive in that sense, being able to take that extra turn and also get more bird tokens and then being able to stack in for more damage. It's definitely very good in that sense. And then because we're not really playing, these 2 cards are kind of very late game, they do get cheaper, but we're not really trying to, we don't always need to play them. So we are kind of a little bit later on lands, but we do have 10 plains, 10 islands, and 4 of the pathways. Definitely very solid mana base overall. Most of our creatures are 3-drops, like I said, the exception of the 2 4-drops and the 2 7 drops, possibly 6 drops if we do foretell it. And then we do have ways to kind of help get to that point. So we do have Academic Probation if we kind of understand what our opponent's playing, or we just have a big clunker in our way. We just need to get, make it not be able to block and or attack, which is definitely very good. Environmental Sciences to kind of help us dig a little bit. In case we're a little bit mana, tight, we can always dig and get more lands, gain some life in the process. Teachings of the Archaics, because we're kind of dumping our hand a lot, we want ways for us to draw more cards back into our hand, and this is kind of one of those lessons that helps us refill our hand back up pretty effectively for 3 mana, which is definitely very good. Introduction, yet again, scry 2 and draw on a card just in case we want to draw more cards. We have Expanded Anatomy 2 copies, just for, putting +1/+1 counters on target creature, giving it vigilance so it can stay back on defense, making it that much better. And of course, we have Mascot Exposition, just because if our board gets a little bit light, we can always, for a lot of mana, we can always just dump a big Exposition. We get 2/1 Flyer, 3/2 Red-White Spirit, and a 4/4 Red-Blue Elemental token for 7 mana. So overall, pretty decent card here. Just kind of one of those things, just in case if we feel like we're not drawing a lot of creatures or we may have lost a lot of creatures, we do have a way to kind of get more creatures. Though these creatures don't really have any effects, but it's just a way to kind of, finish off our opponent, hopefully. But overall, this is kind of my idea, kind of so far, kind of still messing around with my Azorius Aggro for that post-rotation kind of thing. Like I said, if you have any feedback on the deck overall, tell me what you think. Leave a comment down below. Tell me what you would swap out if there is something that you kind of like better. I do now, looking at the deck, I do kind of realize I did forget, I think, one card that was in my Azorius Aggro that I do think makes rotation. I do think it's, the Clarion Spirit, which is definitely a very good card here. I'm unsure of where I would cut, because I do think you want to have a decent amount of spells combined with creatures. Stonebinder's Familiar, in my opinion, kind of, I feel like, fits. Maybe we get rid of a couple copies, or we maybe cut down a couple Stonebinders, maybe we cut down a Stonebinder, a Cleaver, and a Cemetery Sage, and maybe just kind of add in 3 copies of it into the 2-drop slot. Who really knows? It's just one of those things that, as we kind of get closer, we'll kind of get more playtests and we'll kind of be able to figure it out. Now, this next deck up is a deck that kind of holds a place in my heart. You probably already are looking at the deck list and you're like, yeah, we've kind of seen this deck list pop up multiple times on the channel so far. I don't know. I have a place in my heart for Witherbloom. It's kind of one of my favorite decks, kind of that has come out of one of the more recent formats, just kind of the way it works. I kind of like that there's a lot of triggers. I do like decks that have a lot of triggers, but overall it's a deck that's very solid. It has a pretty decent win condition, and it kind of survives just by itself. It doesn't really need too much from a lot of other sets for the most part. other than maybe the land base. But most of the cards that are in the deck are all from Strixhaven. So if you've been farming Strixhaven or bought a lot of, have a lot of packs of Strixhaven in your collection, there's a good chance that you do have a lot of these cards already in your collection. But overall, it's a very strong deck, like I said. If you can go off, and cast like your Sedgemoor Witch, you can cast your Witherbloom Apprentice. Because it's post-rotation, we are going to play Dina in the deck. We do play 4 copies because this is an ability we definitely do want, because we want the ability of whenever we gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. So because we are playing the pest, we definitely want ways for our opponent to lose life in that process. So Dina is kind of like a replacement for the Bastion of Remembrance, I think is what it is. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know why I'm thinking Bastion, but that's the card that's coming in my head. But it's just another card that kind of helps us, ping our opponent for that additional damage, which is always very good. Combine that with the Witherbloom Apprentice, we're pinging them for even more damage. So overall, pretty good. So I think the deck stays pretty much the same for the most part. I do think there's a couple cards I do have in here that I don't have in my current version of the deck. But, we got the 4 copies of the Eye Twitch for the Learn ability. We have the Valentine, Dina the Vayne, and also the Set for the dual kind of side of ability. The Valentine kind of helps us in the early game, kind of, being a 1/1 lifelink or menace, which is definitely very good, very strong. He takes 2 people to block in order to, block him. But whenever one of our opponent's creatures do die, we can pay 2 if we do create a 1/1 pest token. So definitely very good there. And the Lisette having the ability to that whenever we gain life, we may pay 1 if we do put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures then gain trampled end of turn. Definitely very good. Also, pumping to the board is very strong. She's kind of like, she has that ability that kind of helps finish off the game. We got Village Rites as a very strong card to help us just draw, extra cards, which is always very good at the cost of a sacrificing a creature and drawing 2 cards at instant speed. But combine that with the way we can make pests in this deck, it's definitely not a problem for us to have something to target with it. Hunt for Specimens to also learn, creates a 1/1 black pest token, gets one to our learn board, which is always very good. Home of the Forbidden is kind of like one of the ways we kind of finish off our opponent. And the idea that we draw a card, we lose a life, we can actually copy it based on how many creatures we sacrifice. So if we have a lot of pests, we can kind of sacrifice them, draw X cards, gain X life, lose X life in the process, but we kind of cancel that out. And combine that with Sedgemoor Witch is whenever we sacrifice those pests and we make more copies of this, we then create more pests to kind of replace it, so we don't really lose too much, which is definitely very, very good. I kind of already went over Dina. She has an ability that whenever we gain life, our opponent loses 1 life, and we can sacrifice another creature. She gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is that sacrifice creature's power. So just in case we need to get that little bit of extra damage in, or maybe our opponent's targeting one of our creatures, we can kind of sacrifice it in the process, give her a little bit extra power, maybe get in for that extra point of damage that maybe we may need to kind of finish off our opponent in total. Then you got the Witherbloom Apprentice. Yet again, whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, each opponent loses 1 life, gain 1 life. Just another way that we can ping our opponent's life total down without really having to hit them with with attacking. So definitely very good there. We got the Witherbloom command. Just an interesting card that, yet again, trying out. It is unfortunate, it's sorcery speed, but it does only cost 2 mana. And we get to choose 2. We get to target player mills 3 cards, then we return a land card from our graveyard to our hand. So in case we want to mill and get a land, we can do that. We can destroy target non-creature, non-land permanent with a mana cost 2 or less. Could be very good if there's like a creature that our opponent does have that we don't want in the way. Target creature gets -3/-1 until end of turn. Kind of an interesting way to kind of nerf a creature that our opponent has. The -1 doesn't really help just because a lot of creatures do have high toughness, or at least 2 toughness. So interesting. May not choose this too often. Yet again, this is a card that we're kind of messing around with. You have to do it beforehand. We can't interact and kind of do it in response. So it's kind of unfortunate in that sense. And then on top of it, target opponent loses 2 life and we gain 2 life. It's just an overall interesting card that costs 2 mana that we're messing around with to kind of see how it plays out overall. Then we got the Sedgemoor Witch, like I said, if you haven't seen any of my other Witherbloom decks. Just a very solid card. Menace has Ward, so it makes our opponent pay life in order to actually target with a spell or it gets countered. And it has Magecraft, and whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, create a 1/1 black-green pest creature token. And when it dies, you gain a life. You know what it is, the pest tokens, they're very annoying. We have Mortality Spear as kind of like our single target removal. Removal's going to be really interesting because I really don't know where we're going to shift come removal-wise, because I do think removal's kind of a little bit all over the place. I don't know if we're going to poison the cup and whatnot. Who really knows where the removal's going to really shift when it comes to what you're going to see when you come play. But I do think Mortality Spear works for the synergy of our deck. It destroys target permanent, non-land permanent, so destroys anything other than lands, which is definitely very good. And it costs 2 less if we gain life this turn. So if our opponent has killed one of our pests or we sacrifice a pest, we can always pay 2 mana instead of 4 mana, and we destroy anything other than a land. And then we got Demigod, the Woe Eater. It's a 4 mana 7/6. At the beginning of our upkeep, we have to sacrifice a creature. And then when we sacrifice himself, you know, each opponent discards a card, we draw a card, and we gain 2 life. Just an overall interesting card that kind of helps us, you know, kind of get a little beefy, have a big creature that opponent may not want to attack into. And also combines very well with Dina, which is definitely very good. You know, if we have to we can sacrifice it to Dina, you know, gain, you know, 2 life, draw a card, make our opponent discard a card, and then she becomes like, you know, she becomes a 7 or an 8/3, which is definitely very good. And then the mana base, like I said, is pretty straightforward. We got 10 swamps, 8 forests. We have 4 of the pathways of the black and green. We also have 2 of the snarls. Just an overall pretty solid mana base. We are only running 24 lands because our deck isn't on the most expensive side. You know, our biggest things are 4 mana. That other than this becomes cheaper, so it's not always going to be 4 mana, which is definitely very good. And then on our sideboard, we have 2 Necrotic Fumes because we do have pests that we can always sacrifice to probably then more than likely exile target creature or planeswalker. We have a Containment Breach because in case our opponent does play any sort of artifact or enchantment, we can always, you know, destroy it. We created 1/1 black pest creature token, which is definitely very good. Basic Conjuration, in case we want to like dig and look for a new creature. We can look top 6 stars of our library. We may reveal a creature card from among them, put into our hand, put the rest on the bottom of our library in any random order, and we gain some life. Definitely a pretty good card if we want to get some momentum. If we, you know, our board's a little bit light and we're looking for something to kind of fill our board up with. And then we have 3 copies of Pest Summon just to kind of fill out the rest of the sideboard. But overall, a pretty interesting Witherbloom deck. I do like I said, I feel like I kind of have something already kind of crafted kind of similar to this, though I do think there's some cards that, you know, are going to rotate out in my current build, but this is definitely something I could shift into once, you know, rotation does happen. But like I said, guys, if you want to leave a comment about which deck you may want to tweak, which deck you're excited to maybe try out, if you have your own idea, let me know down in the comments below. If you like the video, guys, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to upload new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. With that being said, I'll see you in the next video.